Contractions. What are they? Why do we use them? And more specifically, which ones should we use? I will also answer a really good question today from a viewer. Contractions are simply two or sometimes three words pushed together to make one word. Where letters are missing, we put an apostrophe. Don't forget the apostrophe. We do all this just to make our speech flow. Contractions are there to make your life easier. As an example, one of my Spanish-speaking students had trouble saying if it is. The answer? Just say if it's. Okay, so when is it appropriate to use a contraction? Well, contractions are very informal, so don't use them in formal writing or in a very formal speech. But with informal situations like casual conversations or emails to friends, they are perfectly acceptable. So, what words can we contract? The simplest is a pronoun followed by a be verb. I am becomes I'm, you are, we are, and they are become you're, we're, and they're. He is and she is become he's and she's. But be careful with the pronunciation of he's. Make sure you give it a good E sound so that it doesn't become confused with his. He's, his. Got it? Great. We can also contract pronouns with some modal and auxiliary verbs, but not all of them. Have, has, and had can be contracted with a pronoun in the perfect tenses. For example, they've been, she's done, he'd gone, and we'd better. However, if you were using have, has, or had as a main verb to indicate possession, don't contract it with a pronoun. It just sounds weird and wrong. This is because he or she has and he or she is contract in the same way. Example, she's a new car. It sounds like you're saying she is a new car. So just keep it to the perfect tenses and you'll be fine. The exception is the common phrase, I've an idea, which is fine to say, but in general, don't contract have, has, or had as a main verb. We can contract will and would with a pronoun. For example, she'll find us. It'd be better if I went home. Notice that had and would both contract to apostrophe D. He'd could be he had or he would. How do you tell which it is? Well, it's back to the past participle again, indicating the past perfect, he had. For example, he'd been to Cuba twice when I met him. Would doesn't come before a past participle. He'd do well if he tried harder. Now that one has to be would. Modal verbs can also be contracted with the auxiliary verb have to make the present perfect. Could have, would have, might have, should have, must have. The exception is ought to. We can't contract to and have, so write it as ought to have. Although if you say it fast, you will naturally drop the H. You ought to have done that by now, but it's still not technically a contraction. It is quite common to use contractions with negative sentences. This was my viewer question. He asked me which to use, apostrophe S and not, or he or she isn't. The answer is that both are perfectly acceptable. This is the same for the pronouns that go with are. They're not or they aren't, we're not or we aren't. However, sometimes we can use the pronoun contracted with the be verb followed by not to emphasize the negative. We are still using a contraction, but by keeping the whole word not, we're putting a little more stress on the negative. For example, she isn't wearing that. It's just a statement of fact. Or, she's not wearing that. Can you hear how I'm emphasizing the negative? So, we know that we can use a be verb with not to make a negative contraction. But we can also use auxiliary verbs with not to make contractions as well. Examples are didn't, doesn't, haven't, hasn't, and hadn't. Also modal verbs can't, couldn't, mustn't, mightn't, or shouldn't, oughtn't, wouldn't, and won't. I did mention that we can push 3 words together. This happens when we are making a negative with a modal verb in the present perfect. Mightn't have, shouldn't have, can't have, and so on. You shouldn't have done that. Okay, I think that's about enough for contractions for one day. Let me know if you found this helpful. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Bye!